Hello, and welcome to The Game Changer, a series hosted by Kitman Labs, where we cover everything from sporting teams and sports science to cutting-edge technology.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Andy Shelton, Performance Scientist here at Kitman Labs. My role is to help professional and college teams use data to enhance performance. Kitman Labs is a sports science and analytics company which helps teams to find meaning in their data to improve performance and reduce injuries. Kitman Labs partners with many teams in many sports, including the New York Yankees, and we're lucky today to be joined by Mike Wickland, Coordinator of Preventative Programs in the Performance Science Department. Prior to joining the Yankees, Mike graduated from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in 1999, and then during his tenure in the minor league setup with the Yankees, he won the minor league Florida State Athletic Trainer of the Year award in 2007, and has worked with a number of high-profile names. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Andy.
We're really excited to have you with us, Mike. How did all of that previous experience as an athletic trainer set you up for this role in the strength and conditioning department and now within the performance science department?
Well, it was actually the blending of athletic training and strength and conditioning, and I get to use skills from both of those disciplines in performance science. When I transitioned from athletic training into strength and conditioning, I, up to that point in my career, with continuing education classes, had just been involved in athletic training. And when I transitioned into the weight room, my continuing education focus was different as well. And I was really surprised by what I learned in strength and conditioning that I felt would have made me a better athletic trainer. In my current role now, I get to use aspects of each of those areas in what I do now.
And what were the specific examples, or what were the kind of key themes which helped you to become a better athletic trainer with what you were learning in the strength and conditioning realm?
It's just basically an athletic training. More of what you do is more isolated joint by joint work on the table. And then in the strength and conditioning, it's more functional. And so it's basically the blending of those two areas that helped along the way.
And then with performance science then, how does that relate to both of those areas? And what does your typical day look like to help out those two areas?
In the performance science role now, it's about collecting data and doing everything that we can to better understand the individual. As we're collecting data on movement screens with range of motion testing, with strength testing, it's looking at the player individually and designing a program for him that best fits his individual needs.
Can you give a couple of different examples of where you have two players who, in theory, you could treat the same because they're in the same position maybe, but actually you treat and train them very differently?
Sure. I mean, take two shortstops, for example. You know, if you're just going off position alone, obviously lateral agility is important, flexibility is important, but those two guys most likely are very different. And that's where we look at how the guy moves, coupled what we measure with a physical therapy perspective. And then it's talking to the coach about what the coach is trying to accomplish with each player. And given all that information, we can better tailor and design programs around the individual needs.
And is that the way in which you decide which data to actually collect and how to collect that data as well? Going backwards from essentially performance and speaking to the coaches and speaking to the players to determine what do you actually need in order to answer those questions and to develop their performance, or do you come at it from a slightly different angle?
No, and we collect a large amount of information on these players, and all of it might not be relevant to what that player needs. And that's where the input from our coaches is really important in determining how we tailor these programs, because just because we measure something on a player and we feel as a performance science staff that it's meaningful to the player, in reality it might not be. And that's where combining information and cross-department communication is really important for us.
So what sort of themes would a coach be interested in when they're developing, or when they're coming to you and saying that they want to develop a particular either skill or area of performance within, a shortstop or any of the other positions?
It would really depend upon the position that we're talking about. If it's a catcher, for example, obviously lower body flexibility is a big deal. And if a player is struggling in that contact, it's up to us to find out why. It could be something in his lower back. It could be something in an ankle. It could be any host of reasons why a player could not perform a specific movement. And the more data we have, the better we understand the individual, the better we can individualize his program.
So on the flexibility side of things, what tools would you use in order to collect information on that?
Again, we use a goniometer, joint by joint, look at hips, knees, ankles, and we do a movement screen as well. So we putting together what we see visually with what we measure with the goniometer. And that information combined can give us the best plan of attack on the player.
And then what action may actually happen from that? I mean, obviously it depends on data which you've collected, but can you give an example of a specific player or generally speaking, if someone is lacking flexibility in that area, what you might find in those tests and how you then could go about solving those problems?
Yeah, if we have a large data set that's been collected and we know what is quote unquote normal or good for a respective position, if a player measures below normal on a specific range of motion test, then we can focus our attention on that specific body part to improve flexibility.
And would you literally do that through stretching more, or would you do different types of exercises or different types of mobility work? How do you actually kind of take action off that, or what does the player actually do?
To answer your question, it's really all the above. And again, that's where my background in athletic training, which is more soft tissue work, joint mobilization, coupled with the strength and conditioning, you're getting into more functional training at that point. So to answer your question, let's say, for example, ankle dorsiflexion restriction, we may need to get in and do specific joint mobilizations on the ankle, soft tissue mobilization with the Achilles up through the gastroc, and from there put it into a functional movement. And that would be dependent on the position of the player as to what movement we choose to do.
That makes perfect sense. And you spoke a little bit about how the coaches help obviously guide some of that and what data you actually collect. Does it happen the other way around as well, where you mentioned there that you have normal data players in particular positions around specific joints and ranges of motion, and I'm assuming obviously strength and power as well. Are you able to actually be proactive about this as opposed to just waiting for the coaches to suggest performance problems to you?
No, absolutely. Again, just through the process of collecting data and having an idea of what would be considered good or bad. If I'm looking through this stuff or I see a movement screen that something doesn't look right on that, again, my next step in the process is to talk to a coach and see if what was assessed is what is actually an issue for the player on the field. And again, it's combining all that information that helps us to better understand players individually.
Yeah, fantastic. And you mentioned there about some issues which might happen in range of motion test. Clearly, this isn't just from a performance standpoint, but also from an injury reduction or injury prevention standpoint as well.
Sure. So again, as we go through our assessment process, as we see numbers that may be considered low based on our population or abnormally high if it's a hypermobility issue, we would highlight those players as a greater risk factor or risk potential. And we then compile and design individualized programs for those players so that their individual needs are being taken care of.
Specifically with pitchers, I know that's a big area of focus in baseball. I think in 2015 alone, there was $420 million worth of pitchers unavailable to the major league teams, obviously. Pretty much the whole of that was through shoulder and elbow injuries. In my mind, the teams who are stopped thinking about, injuries just happen, and they actually try and figure out how to reduce these, could have a huge competitive advantage. Well, what's your opinion on that, and how could a team go about, potentially reducing some of those injuries?
Yeah, I think that's every team objective is to figure out why. And again, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of that goes to better understanding the individual. And there's a lot that goes into that. Under that heading, that includes nutrition, that includes workload, that includes strength, that includes flexibility. So, rather than just, handling these guys on a standard program, the better we can understand them as individuals, I think, could impact the injury potential for the shoulders and the elbow.
So, Mike, you mentioned there about range of motion. Do you think that that's something which is better assessed every day or every week, or is that something which we can look at across the course of the season? You wouldn't obviously look at workload across the course of the season. You'd want to know how it changed on a daily basis. Is the same true of some of those other areas that you've mentioned?
I think with nutrition, it would be really difficult to monitor somebody every single day on that. So again, that's something where there's probably an additional meeting with the player and then periodic, say, weekly follow-up as to how everything's going. I think with range of motion, especially since we're talking about pitchers, I think it can be so variable based on workload and when guys pitch and how individualized recovery is. I think from a range of motion perspective, the more data you have on that, the better.
Can you talk me through your process around that?
Currently, we do range of motion rechecks with the goniometer 3 to 4 times a year. And we are using Kitman Labs right now to get daily measurements also.
And then you mentioned that things change on basically a daily basis, depending on what their workload has been like, how frequently they've pitched, and obviously the volume of pitching as well. What are some of the outcomes, and what are some of the actions which you could potentially, or any baseball team could potentially take off that data?
I think that before that becomes actionable, that we need to have an understanding of exactly what we're dealing with and what might just be normal for a player. So I think that it might take a full season to see what is a normal range of motion response to a full season of pitching. Because again, I think you can jump the gun and maybe get a bit premature in assuming that someone's range of motion is bad or he's not recovering properly if you don't have a large sample size to base your decision on. So in the short term, it's about collecting data and getting all that you possibly can. And then it's trying to figure out what's normal or an appropriate amount of range of motion variability throughout the course of the season.
Exactly. I completely agree with you on that. And I guess then the end goal after that would be to, if somebody steps out of that normal range for them as an individual and what we would expect to see through the course of a season, that's when you can really be confident to take that action. But it requires a bit of data in order to do that. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. If we're collecting data over the course of the season and we are going to have injuries, and over the course of the year, if we look at the injuries that we had and we did see common themes in guys not responding well or recovering well in between outings, then the following year we might take action as we have done our daily assessments on guys.
Exactly, because if we think about other sports, not just baseball, but where they have had a decent amount of data on how players have responded, generally speaking, as opposed to just specifically range of motion, but then they also have the workload information. It's great to marry those two up in order to see, okay, well, when I do a particular level of workload with a player, on an individual basis, they will respond in this particular way, and understanding the risk which is associated with that. So actually, other sports are actually able to now prescribe the volumes of workload which they know will have the players respond in a safe manner. And obviously, the end goal being that we're improving or increasing the amount of workload which these players can cope with, so that when they come to pitch in a game or pitch in 3 days in a row or pitch once every 5 days, that they're actually able to cope with that from an injury risk side of things. I mean, that's our end goal, isn't it?
Sure. And again, the range of motion piece is just a sliver of what goes into a player's health and performance. And like you said a moment ago, marrying that along with the workload um, could potentially set the player up for the best position to succeed.
Exactly. So you mentioned a little bit about the tool that you use, Capture from Kitman Labs, to assess range of motion on a daily basis or on a frequent basis. What other tools do you use in order to assess not just range of motion, but some of the other areas that you've spoken about there, whether they be in the area of nutrition or workload or strength and conditioning, flexibility? You've spoken about a little bit already.
Yeah, we have a full-time dietitian that handles all of the individual player needs with food. We do standard strength and conditioning testing throughout the season. Vertical jump, which most sports teams do. We have various ways to look at flexibility. And as I said a moment ago, the periodic joint by joint range of motion assessments with the goniometer.
How important do you think that subjective information is in this as well? So either directly from the players or from you guys and your view of how that player is either responding or how they're made up in the first place on an individual basis?
The subjective part's huge because again, where we are in the grand scheme of all this, I would say that we're in the data collection mode right now. And again, as we're trying to understand what this data means, what the player provides to us is a vital piece of that puzzle. And again, the last thing we would ever want to do is move ahead prematurely with data we collect and to plant a problem in the player's head that might not be there. And so as we're looking at data, we want to talk to guys along the way, see how they're feeling, and if what they're feeling kind of matches up with what we've assessed, then we can be more confident in our plan moving forward.
And you touched upon it there. How do the players actually respond to all of this information when you do feed it back to them in bite-sized manners, in a kind of safe way?
It's been really good. It helps on our end to have a relationship with the players and for them to trust us and knowing that what we're doing is in their best interest. And I think it's appreciated whenever we sit down with them and talk to them about what's happening to them as an individual. And, for example, pitchers recover, at different rates. Some guys are most sore the day after they pitch. Some guys it's 2 days after. And if we are assessing range of motion being down on that day two, and that's typically when that guy is most sore, then we would discuss better recovery techniques on the day when he might most need it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So do you think in the future then, based off obviously the subjective information, the objective information, not just in pitchers but in other positions as well, that volume or coaches could be using this information to basically prescribe the volume which the pitcher does on that day to ensure that they can get the maximum amount of training, of practice out of them, but without pushing them over the edge, basically?
Yeah, our pitching coaches do a really good job of watching workload and monitoring workload, but I think with the introduction of technology, it can make a good process even better. And if we've collected enough data over time on pitchers and we know that a player takes longer to bounce back, then that could potentially alter how he's used on any given night.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then I guess also could impact that particular player's practice, so that you're trying to get them safely to an area where they do bounce back quicker, over the next, in terms of a long-term training cycle.
Exactly. And as I've said a couple times before, it just goes back to understanding the individual. And The more we know about the individual, the better we can manage him throughout the season.
So perfect world scenario here then, Mike. Last question on this. What do you see coming out of the woodwork next? What either technology or what data would you love to be able to see, or how would you be able to see that data in order to facilitate that decision-making process for you on each individual player?
First off, the data is going to be accurate. If we are going to adjust or make recommendations on player workload, on player arm care programs, on strength and conditioning programs, we have to trust that the data we're getting is accurate. If the data is accurate, that makes it usable for us. And it needs to be collected in a way that does not interrupt our day. It needs to be non-invasive to players. The way days in baseball are set up, we don't have time to adjust our typical work day around data collection. We're not here to do this isn't a research lab. This is professional baseball. And so whatever we need to do to collect it efficiently, non-intrusively, and accurately, that makes the data usable to us.
Excellent. Mike, I really appreciate your time as always, and good luck with the upcoming season.
Awesome, Andy. Thank you very much.